The city was waking up under a soft morning sun, the streets already busy with the rhythm of ambition. Cars honked in a distance, buses hissed at their stops, and the tall glass buildings shimmered like mirrors of dreams. Inside one of those towers, Hale Global Enterprises, dozens of people sat nervously on the 12th floor, waiting for their turn to be called. The air smelled faintly of perfume, paper, and coffee. Laptops clicked, pens tapped, and whispers filled the waiting area. Among them sat a young woman named Aaliyah Bennett. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, a simple folder resting on her knees. Her hair was tied back, her clothes clean but plain, her shoes worn from walking. She didn't blend in, not because she tried to stand out, but because there was something calm and centered about her that didn't fit the restless energy of the others. She had spent the entire night preparing, reviewing her notes, practicing her answers in front of a mirror, adjusting her posture until it matched the confident tone she wanted to project. This was the chance she had worked toward for years. After finishing university on scholarships and juggling 2 part-time jobs, she had finally earned an interview with one of the most powerful corporations in the city. It was the kind of opportunity that could change everything for her mother, for the tiny apartment they called home, for the life that had always been one bill away from breaking. When the assistant finally called her name, she stood quickly, smoothing her skirt with slightly trembling hands. "Ms. Bennett," the assistant said, eyes running over her clothes before giving a small, forced smile. "This way." Aaliyah followed through the wide hallway, her footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. Every wall was covered with sleek art and awards, proof of power, wealth, and reputation. It was both beautiful and intimidating. She was led into a large meeting room with glass walls overlooking the city. Sunlight poured in through the windows, washing the room in silver light. 3 people sat at a long table, 2 assistants with tablets and, at the head, the man himself, Richard Hale, the CEO. His reputation was legendary. Brilliant, demanding, and mercilessly proud. He was in his late 40s, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression sharp. He didn't smile. He barely glanced at her when Aaliyah entered. He was finishing a conversation on his phone. "I told you, if they can't match the numbers, we walk away," he said, then ended the call with a sigh. He looked up, his eyes scanning her resume without lifting it off the table. "Ms. Bennett," he said finally, "you're here for the junior liaison position." "Yes, sir," she said softly, her voice steady but polite that he leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Tell me, why do you think you can handle a role that deals with billion-dollar clients across multiple countries?" Aaliyah opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, he smirked slightly, tossing her resume onto the table. "You went to a state college?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I graduated with honors," he cut her off. "Honors," he repeated, almost as if the word itself amused him. "Everyone graduates with honors these days. Do you know how many applicants we've had today? Over 200. You know how many came from Ivy League schools?" She stayed quiet. He didn't wait for her to answer. 134, he said, tapping the table. "You're competing with them. People with degrees from Paris, London, and Harvard. So tell me, Ms. Bennett, what makes you extraordinary?" The assistants exchanged small glances, half smiling, waiting for her to fumble. But Aaliyah didn't fumble. She straightened her back, met his gaze, and said softly, "Because I understand people, sir. Not just clients or business, but people. I know how to listen." He raised an eyebrow. "Listening? That's your answer?" "Yes, sir," she said. "Listening is how you build trust. And without trust, no deal lasts." The room fell quiet for a moment. One of the assistants smirked. The CEO leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Interesting philosophy," he said. "But this isn't a charity organization. It's a multinational firm. We don't have time for emotional speeches." He flipped through her resume again, this time reading aloud mockingly. "Customer service job, small translation work, volunteer tutoring, impressive for a student, but hardly corporate material." He dropped the folder back onto the table. "You've got nothing here that says extraordinary." The word stung, sharp and cold. Aliyah stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that her work wasn't about titles or glamour, but effort and persistence. But the laughter of the assistants stopped her. One of them whispered something under his breath. She caught the word rookie. Richard leaned back, folding his arms. Look, Ms. Bennett, I'm sure you're hardworking. But we deal with high-stakes clients who expect perfection. I can't hire someone who'll crumble under pressure. You can see yourself out. For a brief moment, she just stood there, holding her folder against her chest. Her face remained calm, but inside, something broke quietly. Still, she refused to let them see it. She smiled faintly, nodded, and said, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Hale." He gave a short nod, already looking at his phone again. She turned and walked toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. When the door closed behind her, the assistants started whispering again. One laughed softly. 9 languages on her resume? Probably Google Translate. Richard didn't even respond. He just stared out the window, already forgetting her name outside. Aliyah walked down the hallway, her vision blurring. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, echoing like the slow beat of disappointment. She reached the elevator and pressed the button, waiting in silence. When the doors opened, she stepped in, exhaling shakily. Inside the elevator, alone at last, she let her shoulders drop. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not for them. By the time she stepped out of the building, the afternoon sun had shifted behind clouds. The city lights were coming on early, the air filled with the low hum of traffic. She walked past the glass doors, her reflection following beside her, her heart heavy but not defeated. She had faced rejection before, dozens of times, but somehow, this one felt worse. It wasn't about losing the job. It was about being unseen. She found a quiet spot at the edge of a small park nearby and sat on a bench. Her phone buzzed, a message from her mother. "Good luck today, baby. I'm praying for you." Aliyah smiled sadly, typing back, "Did my best, Mom." She didn't have the heart to say she'd been mocked. She leaned back and looked at the sky. The city seemed so tall, so unreachable. But deep down, she told herself one thing: they don't know me yet. One day, they will. Inside the tower, however, things were already beginning to shift. Less than an hour after Aliyah left, the CEO's phone rang again. His assistant hurried in, looking pale. "Sir, the Zurich clients moved the meeting to this afternoon," she said. "They want live negotiation, no translators." Richard frowned. "No translators? Why?" They said the contract revisions need to be discussed in their native language. They're bringing in representatives from 4 branches, all different dialects. He swore under his breath. "Fine. Call our language consultants." "They're unavailable, sir. 2 are abroad, 1's unreachable." He rubbed his temples. "Then find new ones." "We've called everyone," she said. "No one can cover all of them. They're threatening to walk away if the communication fails." Richard stood from his chair, pacing the room. The billion-dollar deal was already fragile. Months of work, millions in investment. Everything depended on this one meeting. And now, it was collapsing because of something as simple as language. His assistant hesitated, then said quietly, "Sir, there was that one applicant this morning. The one you interviewed yourself." She mentioned 9 languages on her resume. He froze, turning slowly toward her. What was her name? Aliyah Bennett. He didn't answer immediately. For a moment, his expression flickered between pride and realization. Then, with a curt voice, he said, "Get her back here. Now." Outside, the sky was turning gray. Aliyah was still sitting in the park when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello," she said cautiously. "Ms. Bennett," came the voice, the same assistant from the morning, now sounding hurried. "Mr. Hale would like to see you again. Immediately." She blinked. "Is this a joke?" "No. He asked for you by name. There's been a change in circumstances." Aliyah stared ahead, the city lights glowing faintly in the mist. Something in her chest stirred, not revenge, not anger, but quiet resolve. She stood slowly, brushing off her skirt. "Tell him I'm on my way," she said as she walked back toward the tower. Her reflection followed her in every window. The same girl, but different now. The sting of humiliation had turned into fire, a calm, steady flame that no laughter could extinguish. She didn't know what waited for her inside that building. But for the first time all day, she wasn't afraid. Because sometimes the world doesn't give you a second chance, but when it does, it's your silence, not your anger, that makes the loudest sound. And by the end of that day, the man who had mocked her would learn that lesson in front of everyone who thought they already knew what power looked like. The streets shimmered with evening light as Aliyah hurried back toward the tall glass tower that had humiliated her only hours ago. The city around her felt louder, sharper, filled with the sound of engines, heels on pavement, and conversations rushing through the air. But inside her, everything was silent. Each step she took was heavy but steady, her heart calm in a way it hadn't been before. The words from that interview still echoed faintly in her mind. "You've got nothing here that says extraordinary," but this time they didn't sting. They burned like quiet fuel, each syllable sharpening her focus. She didn't know why they had called her back, only that she would walk into that building with her head held high. When she entered the lobby, the receptionist who had barely glanced at her that morning now stood up quickly. "Ms. Bennett, they're expecting you," she said politely, her tone suddenly respectful. Without waiting for her reply, the receptionist pressed a button and said into the phone, "She's here." Within seconds, an assistant appeared, one of the same young men who had smirked during her interview. But his confidence was gone now, replaced by unease. "Right this way, Ms. Bennett," he said quietly. As they walked through the hall, Aliyah noticed the shift in the building's energy. People rushed past with files in their hands, their voices clipped and tense. Phones rang constantly. She could feel the pressure in the air, as if the company itself was holding its breath. The assistant opened a door to a meeting room, and there stood the man who had dismissed her, the CEO himself, Richard Hale. He wasn't lounging back in control anymore. His jacket was off, his tie loosened, and his eyes carried the weight of something far heavier than pride. Papers were scattered across the table, laptop screens glowed with spreadsheets and charts, and several managers stood in a circle, arguing in low, frustrated voices. When he looked up and saw her, there was no mockery in his face this time, only desperation disguised as formality. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." She didn't speak immediately. She stood still, her folder pressed against her chest like before, but this time she met his eyes with quiet steadiness. "You said I wasn't qualified," she said softly. The room went still. Richard exhaled slowly. "I might have been wrong." The sentence came out like sandpaper, forced through pride and exhaustion. One of the executives stepped forward. "Ms. Bennett, we're in a difficult position," he said. "Our Zurich clients are threatening to pull out of the deal. They moved the meeting ahead of schedule, and they've brought representatives from 4 regions, each speaking their own language. Our translators are unavailable, and we're running out of time. And you need someone who can speak to them," Aliyah said quietly. "Precisely," Richard said. He paused, studying her face. "You mentioned 9 languages on your resume. Were you exaggerating?" "No, sir," she said. "I learned them." The silence that followed was long, almost reverent. He nodded once. "Then we need your help." He gestured toward the conference room beyond the glass wall. Inside sat a group of foreign delegates, each speaking quietly among themselves, their expressions stern and unimpressed. The tension was visible even through the glass, the crossed arms, the tight frowns, the tapping fingers. "You'll be translating for us," Richard said, his tone clipped. "If this deal falls apart, the company loses everything. Understand?" "I understand," she said calmly. He motioned to the assistant. "Get her the documents. Bring her up to speed." But as she sat at the table and began to review the papers, Aliyah realized just how bad the situation was. The deal wasn't simply about money, It was the foundation of the entire company's global expansion. Without it, Hale Global would lose investors, credibility, and possibly its future. Every contract term was written in layered language, half in English, half in dialects she recognized from different parts of Europe and Africa. It was a mess. Still, she didn't panic. While the others whispered in frustration, she quietly read, translating lines in her head, making notes in the margins. After 15 minutes, she looked up and said, "I'm ready." Richard blinked, taken aback. "You've read the entire file." "Twice," she said simply. "We don't have much time. Let's start." The board members exchanged doubtful glances, but no one dared to stop her. The door to the conference room opened, and everyone entered. The foreign delegates turned their eyes toward the newcomers, their faces stern. The lead representative, an older man in a dark suit, said something sharp in French, his tone impatient. Aliyah stepped forward before anyone else could speak. She replied fluently, her words smooth and respectful, her accent perfect. The man's eyes widened slightly. He responded again, this time in another dialect, testing her. She switched without hesitation, answering him in his own tongue. Then she turned toward the others, addressing each delegate in their respective languages. German, Mandarin, Yoruba, Italian, her voice calm, confident, and precise. The entire room fell silent. Richard watched in disbelief. Only hours ago, he had dismissed her as another hopeful applicant with an average background. Now he was watching her control a boardroom of billionaires with nothing but her voice and intellect. The conversation shifted rapidly. The delegates, who had arrived with anger and suspicion, began to lean forward, intrigued. Aliyah explained each clause with clarity, ensuring both sides understood every term. When one of the visitors questioned a legal phrase, she corrected it gently, preventing what could have been a costly misunderstanding. When another delegate mentioned past mistranslations that had caused problems, she apologized on behalf of the firm, her tone professional but heartfelt. Within an hour, what had started as a broken meeting had turned into real dialogue. The assistants scribbled notes in awe. The tension in the room began to melt. The lead delegate smiled for the first time all day and said something quietly to her in French. "You speak the language of respect, not just words." She smiled back and replied, "Respect is the only language that matters, sir." When the meeting finally ended, contracts were signed. The handshake that followed was not cold or forced, it was genuine. Cameras flashed as the delegates left the room satisfied. Hale Global had just saved its biggest deal. And the person responsible was the girl who had once been told she wasn't extraordinary. Richard stood by the door, watching her gather the papers. His voice came out low, almost uncertain. "How did you learn all that?" She looked up. "I grew up in a neighborhood where people came from everywhere. I learned to talk to them. When you grow up around many voices, you start to understand more than just words." He nodded slowly, then cleared his throat. "You saved this company." She shrugged lightly. "No, sir. I just did what I do best. Listen." For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then he turned toward his team. "Give her a contract. Effective immediately." The assistants exchanged glances, unsure if they'd heard right. "Sir?" one asked. "You heard me," he said. "She's not leaving this building without a job." But Aliyah hesitated. "With respect, Mr. Hale," she said softly, "I didn't come back for a job. I came back because you asked for help." That answer stunned him more than anything else. In all his years of dealing with powerful people, he had never met someone who didn't beg for position or money. He realized then that she had something none of his elite hires ever possessed: self-worth. "Then at least let me thank you properly," he said, his voice quieter now. "Stay for the debrief. We'll talk after." She nodded, but inside she already knew that her life had just changed. Not because she had impressed a man like Richard Hale, but because she had finally shown herself what she was capable of. As the meeting room emptied, she stood alone by the window for a moment, looking out at the city glowing beneath the night sky. Just a few hours ago, this same skyline had looked impossible, distant, unreachable. Now it felt like something she could touch. Her reflection in the glass stared back. Still the same girl, but now her eyes held something new. Confidence. Not the loud kind built on pride, but the quiet kind built on knowing your worth when no one else does. Behind her, Richard watched silently from the doorway. He didn't interrupt her thoughts. For the first time, the man who had mocked someone else's potential saw what true strength looked like. And it wasn't in money, or power, or control. It was in a girl who had walked back into the same room that broke her, and rebuilt it with nothing but grace. And as he turned away, one thought followed him like a whisper he couldn't shake. Sometimes the people we dismiss are the ones who save us in ways we never expect. The next morning dawned with the faint light of a restless sky, clouds floating lazily over the city like slow-moving thoughts. Inside her small apartment, Aliyah sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea untouched beside her. Her mother, Gloria, moved quietly in the background, packing lunch for her own shift at the hospital. The radio murmured softly, filling the silence with the sound of distant news anchors talking about markets, politics, and things that had little to do with the two women in that tiny room. "You're quiet this morning," her mother said finally, glancing at her daughter. Aliyah smiled faintly. "Just tired, Mom." "You didn't sleep," Gloria said knowingly. "You've got that look again. The one you get when something's sitting heavy on your heart." Aliyah looked down at her hands. "It's nothing. Just, yesterday didn't go how I hoped." Gloria put down the lunchbox, wiping her hands on a towel before sitting across from her. "You've faced worse." "Yeah," Aliyah said softly. "But it's not about facing it. It's the feeling of being seen and dismissed before you even speak." Her mother reached over, placing a hand on hers. "You can't control how people see you, baby. But you can control how you carry yourself after. They don't define your worth, you do." The words lingered in the air like a soft promise. But before Aliyah could reply, her phone buzzed against the table. Unknown number. She frowned, picking it up. "Hello." "Ms. Bennett," a familiar voice said. It was the same HR assistant who had escorted her out yesterday. His tone was polite, almost nervous. "This is Hale Global Enterprises. Mr. Hale would like to meet with you again. He asked that you come in immediately." Aliyah blinked. "Mr. Hale?" she repeated slowly. "Yes. He requested you by name. It's urgent." For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Yesterday, that man had looked at her like she didn't belong in his building, and now he wanted her back? "Is this about the interview?" she asked cautiously. "Yes," the voice said. "He'd like to discuss a role, something time-sensitive. Can you make it within the hour?" Her mother was already watching her closely. Aliyah hesitated, then said quietly, "Yes, I can." When she hung up, Gloria tilted her head, a small knowing smile forming. "See," she said. "The world doesn't forget when you walk out with dignity." Aliyah exhaled, half laughing. "Maybe it's just a mistake." "Or maybe," her mother said, standing and touching her shoulder gently, "it's your moment coming back around." An hour later, Aliyah stood once again before the tall glass doors of Hale Global. This time, she didn't pause to gather courage. She simply walked in, her reflection following beside her, calm and sure. The receptionist recognized her instantly. "Ms. Bennett," she said, smiling a little too quickly. "They're waiting upstairs." There was no waiting room this time, no clipboard, no receptionist smirk. The elevator doors closed around her, and the ride up felt endless. The higher she went, the quieter it became, until the only sound was the low hum of the elevator and the beating of her own heart. When the doors opened, Richard Hale himself stood waiting in the hallway. No assistance, no arrogance, just him. His expression was different, stripped of pride. "Ms. Bennett," he said, gesturing toward his office. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," she said simply. He motioned for her to sit. The office looked different today, less like a palace and more like a war zone. Documents were scattered across the table. Several phones blinked with missed calls, and his laptop screen displayed a row of unread messages. The calm precision that had defined him yesterday was gone, replaced by quiet chaos. He didn't waste time with small talk. "You already know about the Zurich deal?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Your assistant mentioned it yesterday." "It's worse than that now," he said, rubbing his temples. "The delegates are arriving in 2 hours, and they've demanded to renegotiate everything. They brought multiple representatives, each from a different region. No one here speaks all their dialects, and our lead interpreter just cancelled." He looked up at her, and for the first time, there was something like humility in his eyes. "They told me you listed 9 languages on your resume. I need to know if that's true." "It's true," she said. "I wouldn't lie about something like that." "Then I need your help," he said quietly. The words felt strange coming from him, like a sentence he wasn't used to saying. Aliyah studied his face. The sharp arrogance from yesterday had softened into something almost human, something she hadn't expected to see. "I'll do what I can," she said. When she entered the conference room, the tension was thick enough to touch. 5 men and 2 women sat around the table, each from different countries, each talking in overlapping conversations that none of the others seemed to understand. The air was heavy with frustration. Aliyah walked to the head of the table, standing quietly for a moment, just listening. Then she spoke, in perfect French. One of the delegates stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening. She turned to another and greeted him in fluent Mandarin, then to the next in German, her voice flowing smoothly from one language to the next. Within minutes, the chaos in the room had shifted. The arguing stopped. The delegates began to smile, surprised and intrigued. She didn't just translate words. She translated meaning, tone, emotion. She explained their concerns clearly, turning tension into conversation, confusion into clarity. When one man spoke angrily about the terms, she responded not with defense but with understanding, explaining the misunderstanding in his own language until his expression softened. Richard sat at the far end of the table, silent, watching everything unfold. The meeting stretched for hours, but Aliyah never faltered. She handled technical clauses, legal terms, and subtle cultural differences with ease. Every time someone tried to interrupt her, she raised her hand slightly, commanding the room without raising her voice. It wasn't authority born of power, it was respect earned through presence. By the end of the meeting, documents were signed, smiles returned, and hands were shaken. The billion-dollar deal that had been seconds from collapse was saved, not by a board of executives, but by the girl who had once been told she wasn't extraordinary. When the delegates left, the room erupted in applause. Richard stood slowly, still staring at her, as if trying to understand what he had just witnessed. "You just did what 3 departments couldn't," he said. "You saved this company." Aliyah looked down at the papers on the table and said softly, "No, sir. I just listened." That answer silenced the room more than applause ever could. The assistants looked at each other, unsure what to say. Richard exhaled slowly, his pride bending into gratitude. "You're not leaving this building without a contract," he said firmly. "You belong here." She looked at him calmly, her voice steady. "Yesterday you said I didn't." The words weren't bitter, just honest. He nodded. "And today I learned how wrong I was." As she walked out of that room, the entire staff turned to look at her. The same people who had whispered and laughed before now stood silently, their expressions unreadable. A few smiled faintly. Most didn't know what to say. Aliyah didn't need them to. She stepped into the elevator again. But this time her reflection wasn't small or uncertain. It was strong, grounded, unshaken. When the doors opened onto the street below, the city light hit her face like the beginning of something new. She breathed deeply, feeling the air change around her. Back in his office, Richard stood by the window long after she left. The skyline glimmered in the distance, but for once he didn't feel taller than it. He thought about her words. "I just listened." In all his years of leadership, of commanding and controlling, he had never really listened. Maybe that's why his empire had come so close to breaking. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the weight of his success, he felt something unfamiliar stir. Respect. Not for her skills, not for her languages, but for her dignity, for the grace she had shown even when he had shown her none. It was the kind of respect that changed people, the kind that made him see the cracks in his own walls. He didn't know it yet, but that day would mark the beginning of his own transformation. For Aliyah, it was the moment the world finally caught up to what she had always known. That extraordinary doesn't come from where you studied, how you dress, or what you own. It comes from what you carry inside when no one else believes in you. And as the sun sank behind the buildings, turning the glass towers gold, the same building that had once humiliated her now stood as the place where her story began again. The next day began with rain, soft at first, then steady, washing the city in silver streaks that slid down windows and pooled at curbs. In her small apartment, Aliyah woke before sunrise, her mind still replaying the events of the previous afternoon like a dream that refused to fade. She had walked into that building a rejected applicant and walked out having saved $1 billion deal. Yet even as she brushed her teeth and packed her bag for work, she felt a quiet disbelief beneath the pride. Had she really done it? Or had it all been a desperate moment, a coincidence of timing? She didn't know. All she knew was that she was expected back at Hale Global at 9 sharp, and this time not as a candidate, but as part of the team. When she stepped into the lobby, she noticed immediately that everything felt different. The same receptionist who had barely looked at her days ago now smiled brightly and said, "Good morning, Ms. Bennett." People glanced up from their desks as she passed, some whispering her name, others pretending not to stare. She could feel their eyes on her, a strange mix of curiosity and respect. But Aliyah didn't let it distract her. She went straight to the top floor, where the world of executives moved like a machine, precise, cold, relentless. When she entered the conference room, Richard Hale was already there. He looked up from his papers, offering the faintest hint of a smile. "You're early," he said. "I didn't want to be late," she replied, standing tall. "Good," he said. "You'll need that attitude." He gestured for her to sit. "The board meets in an hour. They want to see the full report from yesterday's deal and hear your explanation of how you managed it. I'm warning you, they're not easy to impress." "I'm not here to impress them," she said simply. "I'm here to work." That answer made him pause. He studied her face for a long moment, as though trying to read the person he'd misjudged so badly. "You really don't care about their approval, do you?" he said quietly. "No, sir," she said. "Approval fades. Results stay." He almost smiled again, but before he could reply, one of the assistants knocked on the door. "Sir, the delegates from Tokyo are on the line. They're demanding immediate clarification on the contract terms." Richard looked at Aliyah. "You ready for another test?" She nodded. Minutes later, she was seated in front of a screen, a row of serious faces staring back from another continent. The Japanese partners were furious. Claims of miscommunication, payment delays, and mistranslated clauses filled the air. Richard tried to calm them, but it was clear they weren't listening. Then, quietly, Aliyah leaned forward. "If I may," she said, switching flawlessly into Japanese. The men on the screen froze mid-sentence. She bowed slightly and began to explain the situation, her tone formal but warm, respectful yet firm. As she spoke, the tension on their faces began to ease. Within minutes, the conversation transformed. Misunderstanding turned to cooperation, anger turned to relief. When the call ended, one of the delegates said softly, "Your company is fortunate to have her." Richard turned off the monitor and looked at Aliyah with an expression somewhere between pride and disbelief. "You just turned another storm into sunshine," he said. "It's just communication," she said modestly. "It's respect." Word of her skill spread quickly through the company. By lunchtime, her name was on everyone's lips. Some spoke with admiration, others with envy, but none could ignore what she had done. She had become the quiet miracle in the building, the girl who spoke 9 languages, the one who saved the company when everyone else had failed. Yet Aliyah remained unchanged. She didn't gloat, didn't demand attention. She sat at her new desk, working quietly, responding politely when spoken to. But inside her heart, something warm had begun to grow, a steady confidence, the kind that didn't come from praise but from purpose. That afternoon, the board meeting began. The room was enormous, lined with glass and lit by the grey sky outside. 15 directors sat around a long polished table, their suits immaculate, their expressions skeptical. Richard began the presentation, summarizing the financial details of the saved deal. But halfway through, one of the directors interrupted. "With all due respect, Mr. Hale," the man said, "we've reviewed the reports. And while the numbers look good, we'd like to understand how a junior applicant, someone not even on payroll, was able to negotiate an international contract our entire team couldn't." His tone carried doubt, maybe even insult. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Aaliyah, who sat quietly at the end of the table. "Perhaps Ms. Bennett should answer that herself," he said. The directors turned to her. She could feel the weight of their gazes, measuring, questioning. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was calm, measured, and clear. "When people negotiate," she said, "they think the goal is to win. But the real goal is to make the other side feel understood. If you can do that, they stop seeing you as competition and start seeing you as a partner. I didn't save the deal with language, I saved it with empathy." The room went quiet. Even the director who had challenged her looked down at his notes. Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes proud but unreadable. "And where did you learn that?" another director asked. "From life," she said simply. "From watching my mother work double shifts to care for patients who didn't even know her name. From talking to neighbors who came from countries where no one spoke the same language, but everyone found ways to help each other. You don't need degrees or wealth to learn understanding, you just need to listen." There was silence again, the kind that carried weight. Then, slowly, one of the older directors nodded. "Impressive," he said softly. Another followed. "She's right. We've been running this company on numbers, not connection." Richard cleared his throat. "I intend to change that," he said. "And I intend to start by giving Ms. Bennett a position that reflects her worth." A murmur spread around the table. Aaliyah blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, that's not necessary." "It is," Richard said firmly. "You earned it." The motion was approved unanimously. When the meeting ended, the directors filed out, some stopping to shake her hand. "You've got something rare," one of them said. "Don't lose it." She smiled politely, though her hands trembled when they left. Later that evening, as the office emptied and the rain slowed to a soft drizzle, Aaliyah stood by the window, looking down at the city lights. Richard walked in quietly behind her. "You handled yourself well today," he said. "You've got something this place forgot how to value." She turned to him. "What's that?" "Grace," he said. He leaned against the window, his reflection beside hers in the glass. "I built this company on ambition. Maybe that's why it almost fell apart. You reminded me there's strength in humility too." She didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled faintly. "I only did what I thought was right." "And that," he said quietly, "is exactly why I was wrong about you." They stood there for a long moment, watching the city stretch out below them. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking, letting in thin strands of gold from the setting sun. In that light, for the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger in that building. She belonged there, not because someone finally said she did, but because she had earned it. And as she turned to leave, Richard's voice stopped her. "Aaliyah." She looked back. "Yes, sir." "Thank you," he said simply. No speech, no grandeur, just 2 words that meant more than any award or paycheck could. She nodded, then walked out into the hallway, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The girl who had once been mocked for being ordinary was about to become the soul of a company that had forgotten what extraordinary truly meant. The following weeks passed in a blur of long hours, late nights, and constant movement. Hale Global was no longer the same company it had been before Aaliyah walked through its doors. Where there had once been tension and cold efficiency, there was now something softer, focus, calm, collaboration. People who had barely spoken to one another now shared ideas. Departments that had competed for recognition began working together. And at the heart of it all was Aaliyah Bennett, the woman who had turned quiet strength into power without ever raising her voice. She arrived every morning before sunrise, greeting the cleaning staff by name, and stayed long after most executives had gone home, her desk light the last one glowing through the glass walls. Richard Hale noticed. He noticed the way she never lost patience, the way she listened to every problem no matter how small, and the way her words could turn chaos into order. In the beginning, he had hired her out of necessity. But now, he was beginning to realize something deeper. She wasn't just saving deals. She was changing people. It started with a meeting that no one expected to go well. A powerful investor from Dubai had flown in, furious about an unfinished project, threatening to pull all his funding. Richard was prepared for disaster. But when Aaliyah entered the room, everything shifted. She spoke calmly, asking questions no one else had thought to ask, finding the heart of the man's frustration instead of just defending the company's position. Within an hour, the investor was smiling, his voice soft, and by the end, he not only agreed to stay but also doubled his investment. When he left, Richard turned to her and said, "How do you do that?" She looked at him, a small smile forming. "People don't walk away when they feel heard, Mr. Hale. You just have to listen long enough for them to stop shouting." By the end of the month, every department wanted her on their team. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, but she had something rare, a sense of quiet control that made others trust her. Her name began to travel beyond the building, whispered through boardrooms and across continents. Other companies started calling to ask about the woman who spoke 9 languages and saved Hale Global. Richard refused to let her go. "Tell them she's busy," he would say. But what he didn't tell anyone was that, in her, he had begun to see something he had lost long ago, a reflection of what true leadership looked like before pride had clouded his vision. One evening, after another long day, Richard found himself standing at her office door. She was still working, surrounded by papers and open documents, her hair slightly loose, her pen moving across a page filled with translations. He knocked gently. "Still here?" She looked up, surprised but smiling. "Almost done." "You've said that every night this week," he said, stepping inside. "Do you ever go home?" "Eventually," she said with a soft laugh. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "You know, when I first met you, I thought confidence was about control. Now I think it's about calm. You taught me that." She met his gaze for a moment, unsure how to reply. There was no arrogance in his tone anymore, only sincerity. "You taught yourself," she said finally. "I just reminded you what it looked like." He nodded slowly, almost humbled. "Maybe. But sometimes, reminders come when we least deserve them." The next morning, news broke that shook the entire company. One of their European branches had made a serious mistake. A shipment worth millions was delayed, and the client threatened to cancel all future contracts. Panic spread instantly. Richard called an emergency meeting. Executives crowded into the boardroom, voices rising, accusations flying. Everyone talked, but no one listened. And then Aaliyah walked in. She didn't raise her voice or demand attention, yet within seconds, the room fell silent. "We're not here to blame," she said calmly. "We're here to fix." Her tone was steady, her presence grounding. She laid out a plan so simple yet so effective that by the end of the hour, they had a clear path forward. When the client was contacted, Aaliyah personally took the call. She spoke in his native tongue, explained the mistake honestly, then presented the solution before he could threaten further. By the time she hung up, the contract was safe. When Richard asked how she had managed it, she smiled. Truth sounds different when it's spoken with respect. That phrase stayed with him. Later that evening, as he stood by his office window watching the city glow beneath the sunset, he thought about how different things had become. For years, he had built his empire on perfection, on being untouchable. But Aaliyah had shown him something he'd forgotten. Empires don't last because of fear. They last because of trust. And the more he trusted her, the more he began to trust himself again, not as a CEO, but as a man capable of honesty, empathy, and humility. But success, as always, invited challenge. The same executives who had once admired her began to feel threatened. Some whispered that she was becoming too powerful, that she was taking over quietly. One afternoon, while she was reviewing documents in the break room, 2 employees passed behind her, unaware she could hear them. "She's making him look weak," one said. "You think he'll let that last?" "He's not blind," the other replied. "Sooner or later, he'll have to put her back in her place." She didn't move, didn't speak. But their words struck something deep inside her. Not anger, just sadness. No matter how much good she did, there would always be people who couldn't stand seeing someone like her rise. Still, she chose silence. Let them talk. The truth would prove itself, as it always did. That evening, Richard called her into his office again. His expression was unreadable. "You've heard the rumors," he said. "I don't listen to rumors," she said quietly. "Good," he replied. "Then listen to this instead. I'm promoting you." She froze. "What?" "Director of Global Relations," he said simply. "Effective immediately." "That's," she started, but he raised a hand. "You earned it. You built bridges where walls stood. You turned loss into loyalty. That deserves recognition." For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she said softly, "Thank you." He smiled faintly. "Don't thank me. Just keep proving them wrong." When the announcement went public, the office buzzed with shock. Some clapped, others stayed silent, but one thing was clear. The girl who had once been mocked in that very building was now leading some of its most important decisions. Yet, even in success, she stayed humble. The title didn't change her. She still greeted the janitors, still stayed late, still asked people how their day was. She wore her success quietly, like a simple necklace, something earned, not flaunted. One night, long after everyone else had gone home, she stood alone in the empty hallway, staring out at the city lights. The glass walls reflected her image, strong, composed, yet still the same girl who had once sat outside on the park bench wondering if the world would ever see her. And she realized something then. Being extraordinary wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to yourself that you never needed their permission to rise. In another corner of the city, Richard sat in his apartment, the lights dim, a file open before him. It was Alia's old resume, the one he had once mocked. He had kept it. As he traced his fingers over the faded words, he whispered to himself, "You had everything extraordinary right here, and I was too blind to see it." Then he smiled, shaking his head softly. "But thank God, she made me see." The promotion changed everything and nothing all at once. Alia still arrived early, still greeted the janitors and security guards by name, still carried her same worn leather notebook instead of a designer tablet. But the way people looked at her had changed. Respect had replaced the whispers, admiration had replaced envy, at least on the surface. Yet behind that shine, jealousy grew like a quiet storm. Some called her the CEO's favorite. Others said she got lucky. None of them had seen her sleepless nights, her quiet tears, or the way she had fought to stay kind in a world that rewarded cruelty. She ignored the murmurs, focusing instead on the work. The company had entered a new phase, expanding faster than ever, and she had become the voice of every negotiation. Every client wanted to speak to the woman who could make deals happen. Every major decision went through her hands. Even Richard seemed different now, less the cold businessman and more the man who had learned what humility felt like. Yet power has a way of drawing out old ghosts, and Hale Global's rivals had started circling. It began with a scandal that came out of nowhere. A leaked email, anonymous sources, a false accusation claiming the Zurich contract had been unethically negotiated. Within hours, headlines appeared online, "Insider Scandal Rocks Hale Global, CEO's protégé under fire." The story spread fast, each retelling darker than the last. By the next morning, reporters were outside the building, flashing cameras, shouting questions. Alia arrived through the back entrance, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She found Richard already in his office, the blinds drawn, his face grim. "You saw it?" he asked. "I did," she said quietly. "They're saying you bribed one of the delegates," he said. "It's a lie," she said simply. "I know," he replied, "but the world doesn't wait for truth." She sat down across from him, calm even as her hands trembled slightly. "What do we do?" "We fight it," he said. "But the board is nervous. They've called an emergency session. They'll question you." She nodded. "Let them." The meeting was brutal. Questions fired from every direction. Who leaked the documents? Did she communicate privately with foreign partners? Why did she attend meetings alone? Each question felt like an arrow, each answer a shield. Through it all, Aliyah never raised her voice, never flinched. "If integrity is on trial," she said softly at one point, "then I have nothing to fear. Everything I did was transparent. The real question isn't whether I broke the rules, it's why you all believed I could." Silence followed. Even those who had doubted her lowered their eyes. When she walked out of that room, Richard was waiting in the hall. "You handled that better than I would have," he said. "I learned from the best," she said with a small smile. Days later, the truth emerged. The leak had come from a competitor trying to sabotage Hale Global's reputation. When the investigation cleared her name, the board issued an apology, and the same reporters who had once shouted accusations now called her the woman who stood with grace under fire. But she didn't celebrate. Instead, she went home to her mother's apartment that night and sat quietly at the old kitchen table. Gloria looked up from her tea. "You look tired," she said. "Just another storm, Mom," Aliyah said. "But I think it's passing." Her mother smiled gently. "Storms always pass, baby. That's how you know you're still standing." The next morning, Richard called her to his office again. The light from the window caught the silver in his hair as he stood looking out at the skyline. "You ever think about running your own company?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "Me?" "Yes," he said, turning toward her. "You've already done more than most executives do in a lifetime. You have vision, patience, heart, all the things I didn't when I was your age." She shook her head. "I'm not ready." He smiled faintly. "You were never ready for anything you've already done. You just showed up anyway." She didn't know what to say. For a moment, they stood in silence, two people from completely different worlds who had somehow found common ground not in success, but in growth. "Whatever you decide," he said finally, "just promise me one thing. Don't let the world change your kindness. It's your greatest weapon." "I won't," she said softly. Over the next few months, the company flourished like never before. The Lighthouse Initiative, Aliyah's idea to provide multilingual education grants worldwide, became the company's proudest project. It wasn't about profit, it was about impact. Employees volunteered, partners donated, and schools around the world began teaching children in their native tongues. For the first time in Hale Global's history, headlines didn't talk about money, they talked about meaning. And at the center of it all was Aliyah, standing quietly in the background, smiling at what she had helped create. But even in success, she remained grounded. She still rode the same bus home, still visited her mother every Sunday, still took time to help the interns struggling to find their voices. The difference was that now, when people saw her, they didn't just see a woman who had been underestimated. They saw proof of what integrity looks like when it refuses to break. One evening, as she was leaving the building, she paused by the same glass doors where she had once stood after being humiliated at her first interview. The memory felt distant now, like a scar that no longer hurt but still reminded her of where she came from. She smiled faintly, touching the folder she still carried, a habit she had never abandoned, and whispered to herself, "Extraordinary enough." Outside, the city lights shimmered. The same skyline that had once looked unreachable now spread before her like a promise kept. She didn't notice Richard watching from his office window above, his hands resting on the glass. He smiled quietly, not as a CEO proud of an employee, but as a man grateful for the person who had shown him what redemption truly looked like. In that moment, he understood something deeply. Success is loud, but grace is silent. And it was her silence, her humility, and her strength that had rebuilt everything he had almost lost. As he turned off the lights and left his office, the rain began again outside, soft and steady, washing the city clean, just as one brave woman had done for his soul. The morning sun rose quietly over the city, turning the glass towers gold, the same towers that once seemed unreachable to a girl named Aaliyah Bennett. Inside the gleaming building of Hale Global, the energy felt different now, lighter, human, real. People smiled more, the air of fear that once lingered had faded, replaced by respect that was earned, not demanded. On the top floor, Aaliyah stood by the window of her new office, her reflection glowing faintly in the glass. The skyline stretched endlessly before her, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was looking up at the world. She was part of it now. The walls around her were lined not with awards or certificates, but with photos of people, employees, partners, and children from the global education programs she had helped create. In each picture, there was life, color, and something more important than profit, purpose. She traced her fingers lightly over one of the photos, a classroom in Kenya where kids were learning in their native language thanks to the Lighthouse Initiative. A small smile spread across her face. "We did it," she whispered. Behind her, the door opened softly. Richard Hale stepped in, his presence quieter than it had ever been before. Time had softened him. The sharp edges of pride had been worn down into wisdom. "You've built something beautiful," he said, looking around the room. "It was your idea," she replied. "You gave it life," he said simply. She turned to face him. "You used to run this company like a fortress," she said softly. "Now it feels like a family." He nodded, smiling faintly. "That's because of you. You changed the way people think here. You changed the way I think." "You changed too," she said. "You listened." "Because someone finally taught me how," he said. They stood in silence for a moment, both remembering how far they had come. He had once mocked her for being ordinary, and now he couldn't imagine the company without her. It wasn't just her skill or intelligence that had transformed Hale Global, it was her heart. Her ability to stay kind in the face of cruelty, calm in the face of arrogance, and graceful when the world tried to pull her down. "You know," he said after a pause, "I've been thinking of stepping down." She blinked. "What?" "I'm tired, Aaliyah," he said with a gentle laugh. "I've built my legacy, but I think it's time to hand it to someone who knows how to carry it forward." "You're not serious," she said. "You are Hale Global." He shook his head slowly. "No. I was Hale Global. You are its future." Her throat tightened. "I'm not ready." "You said that the day I offered you a job," he said with a grin. "And look where you are now." She laughed quietly, but her eyes shimmered with emotion. "I don't know if I can fill your shoes." "Don't," he said simply. "Walk in your own." She looked down for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. The idea of leading an empire that had once humiliated her felt surreal. But deep inside, she knew that this was the path life had been preparing her for all along. Not revenge, not pride, but growth. She had turned pain into purpose, and now that purpose was calling her higher. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "then this company has to keep standing for something real. Not just numbers, not just profit, people." "That's exactly why you should lead it," Richard said softly. A few weeks later, the announcement was made. Aaliyah Bennett named new CEO of Hale Global Enterprises. The headlines spread across every major outlet. Reporters called her the face of a new era, the woman who rebuilt corporate humanity, the leader who listens. But when she stood before the cameras at the press conference, she didn't speak about power or progress. Instead, she began with a story. "Years ago," she said, her voice calm but strong, "I came into this building for an interview. I was nervous, hopeful, and determined. I was told I wasn't extraordinary enough. That day broke something in me, but it also built something new. It taught me that worth isn't given. It's proven, quietly, through persistence and respect." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the room. This company almost lost its heart once. But now, We've learned that strength doesn't come from titles or wealth, it comes from empathy. And I intend to make sure that remains our legacy. The crowd erupted in applause, but Aaliyah didn't smile for the cameras. She smiled for herself, for her mother watching on television at home, and for the young women everywhere who would hear her story and realize they were enough. When the event ended and the reporters had gone, Richard found her in the hallway. "You did well," he said. "You spoke from the soul." "That's all I know how to do," she said. He laughed softly. "Then this company's in good hands." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, her old resume, creased and worn. "I kept this," he said, handing it to her. "Reminds me how wrong I was." She looked at the faded paper and smiled. "Maybe it reminds you how right life can be." He nodded. "That too." Later that night, as the city lights shimmered below, Aaliyah stood alone in her office, looking out at the horizon. Her phone buzzed. It was her mother. "Baby, I saw you on TV," Gloria said, her voice thick with pride. "You did it. You showed them." "We did it," Aaliyah said softly. "You taught me to never lose myself." Her mother chuckled. "And you taught them what grace looks like." After they hung up, Aaliyah looked down at her desk where her old resume now sat beneath a framed photo of the Lighthouse children. She whispered, "For every girl who's ever been told she's not enough, this is for you." Outside, the wind carried her words into the city that had once ignored her, now glowing beneath her feet. The world was different now, not because she had forced it to change, but because she had proven that kindness, when held firmly, could be stronger than pride. And somewhere in another part of the city, Richard Hale sat on his balcony, watching the same skyline, a soft smile on his face. The empire he had built no longer belonged to him, but he felt peace for the first time in years. Because sometimes, true success isn't about holding power, it's about passing it to the right hands. As the night deepened and the lights of Hale Global shimmered high above the streets, one floor remained bright, the top one, where a woman who once walked in with trembling hands now led with quiet grace. And though the world below would remember her for saving a billion-dollar deal, she knew the truth. Her greatest victory wasn't in saving a company, it was in saving its soul.